Right now, something is happening between the United States and Canada that most Americans are not paying attention to, but they absolutely should be because it could hit your wallet within weeks. Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, just pushed back hard against Donald Trump's latest trade demands, and the two sides are now locked in what Carney himself is calling a nasty fight. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly what is at stake and why this fight could change the price of everything from lumber to cars to your morning drink. Before we go further, if you are new here, welcome to Wealth Frontline, the channel where we break down the biggest money and power moves happening around the world in plain, simple language, so you always know what is coming before it hits your bank account. Today's story is one of the biggest cross-border economic battles we have covered all year. So let's get right into it. For months now, the United States and Canada have been locked in an escalating tariff war. It did not start overnight. It has been building since Trump returned to office and began reshaping American trade policy, demanding that neighboring countries like Canada and Mexico play by new rules or pay a heavy price. Canada, one of America's oldest and closest trading partners, suddenly found itself facing steep tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles, industries that employ hundreds of thousands of workers on both sides of the border. Mark Carney, a former central banker who became prime minister after promising Canadians he would stand up to Trump, has tried to walk a careful line. He wants to protect Canadian jobs and businesses without completely blowing up the relationship with America's biggest trading partner. But that balancing act just got a lot harder. Trump gave a speech in Las Vegas where he bluntly said Canada is nasty and doubled down on his frustration with how Canadian officials have handled the negotiations. Carney did not back down. Speaking to reporters afterward, he said plainly that the negotiations had turned nasty and that this fight is really about protecting Canadian jobs and the future of Canadian businesses. He said it calmly, almost with a shrug, but the message was clear. Canada is not simply going to roll over and accept whatever terms Washington puts on the table, no matter how much economic pressure is applied. And the pressure is real. Trump has threatened to push tariffs on more Canadian goods as high as 50%, a number that would send shockwaves through entire industries. Canadian officials have responded with their own countermeasures, including restrictions that have affected American alcohol sales in some provinces. Washington's trade representative has pointed to that as proof that Canada and China are the only two nations actively retaliating against U.S. tariffs. But Canadian officials insist their moves are simply a response to tariffs that were placed on them first. This back and forth might sound like typical political noise, but it is not. Tariffs are not abstract numbers on a government spreadsheet. They are taxes that get added to the cost of goods. And companies almost always pass those costs down to regular people. If you have bought a car recently or plan to buy one soon, you have probably already felt some of this. Steel, aluminum, and auto parts moving across the Canada-US border are central to how vehicles get built in North America. And disruptions to that supply chain do not stay contained. They ripple outward into higher prices at dealerships and stores everywhere. Here's what makes this moment especially tense. This is not just about trade numbers, it is personal, and it has been for a while. Back in January at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Carney gave a speech criticizing powerful nations for using economic coercion against smaller countries. He did not mention Trump by name, but everyone in the room knew exactly who he was talking about. The speech earned him praise on the world stage, and it clearly got under Trump's skin because Trump responded directly, warning Carney that Canada, in his words, lives because of the United States. Carney has not walked that speech back, even under pressure. When U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent suggested on American television that Carney had privately backpedaled on his Davos comments during a phone call with Trump, Carney rejected that claim outright. Standing in front of reporters in Ottawa, he rolled his eyes and said clearly that he meant exactly what he said in Davos, and that Canada is now actively working to diversify away from depending so heavily on the United States. That diversification plan is a big deal, and it says a lot about where Canada's head is right now. Carney has talked about pursuing a dozen new trade deals across 4 different continents, all within about 6 months. Think about that for a second. Canada, a country whose economy has been deeply intertwined with the United States for generations, is actively building relationships elsewhere, hedging its bets in case the relationship with Washington keeps deteriorating. That is not the move of a country that feels secure in its current arrangement. There's also the fentanyl issue, which has quietly become one of the more frustrating parts of this whole saga for Canadian officials. Trump has justified some tariffs by pointing to concerns about fentanyl crossing the northern border into the United States. But according to U.S. Customs and Border Protection's own numbers, only a tiny fraction of fentanyl seizures at the border, just a handful of kilograms, have come from the northern border with Canada, compared to thousands of kilograms seized at the southern border. Canadian officials argue this justification simply does not match the data, and that their own billion-dollar border security investments have already reduced illegal drug flow. Trump has also repeated a claim that Canada runs a massive $200 billion trade surplus with the United States, using that number to argue America is being taken advantage of. But that figure does not hold up under scrutiny. The actual trade deficit in physical goods between the two countries last year was closer to $63 billion, and even that gap was partly offset by a surplus of around $33 billion in American services sold into Canada. The real picture is far more balanced than the narrative being pushed publicly, and that gap between rhetoric and reality is part of what is fueling Canadian frustration. Despite all of this tension, it is worth remembering that these two countries are not strangers to negotiation. And there have been moments of surprising warmth mixed in with the hostility. When Carney first visited the White House after becoming prime minister, the meeting was actually fairly cordial. The two leaders praised each other publicly, and Trump even conceded that his old idea of annexing Canada as a 51st state was likely off the table. Carney firmly told him that Canada is not for sale and never will be, to which Trump smiled and said, "Never say never." It was tense, but it was not explosive. That contrast is what makes this current moment so interesting to watch. The relationship between these two leaders swings between cordial and combative, sometimes within the same week. One day, there's a friendly photo opportunity and talk of a broader trade deal being negotiated. The next day, there's a fiery speech calling Canada nasty, followed by a Canadian prime minister publicly refusing to soften his position. This unpredictability is exactly why markets, businesses, and everyday consumers are struggling to plan ahead right now. So, what happens next? Nobody knows for certain, and anyone who tells you they do is guessing. But here is what we do know. Canadian negotiators have continued showing up in Washington for talks, even after the public sniping. Carney has said he expects more conversations with Trump directly, following up on a call the two leaders already had. Neither side seems ready to walk away from the table completely, which suggests that despite the tough talk, both governments understand how damaging a full economic break would be for their own citizens. For American viewers watching this unfold, here is why it actually matters to your everyday life. Canada is one of the largest trading partners the United States has, supplying massive amounts of steel, aluminum, lumber, energy, and automotive parts. When tariffs go up on those goods, American manufacturers who rely on Canadian materials face higher costs, and those costs eventually land on consumers. If you are planning a home renovation, buying a car, or even just filling up your gas tank, changes in this trade relationship can quietly show up in your monthly expenses without you ever realizing why prices crept upward. There's also a bigger picture worth thinking about here, beyond just this one dispute. What we are watching between Carney and Trump is really a preview of how global trade relationships are shifting in this new era. Countries that used to assume close alliances meant stable, predictable trade terms are now being forced to prepare for sudden shifts in policy, aggressive tariff threats, and public confrontations playing out on the world stage. Canada diversifying its trade partnerships is not just a reaction to Trump. It is a signal that many nations are rethinking how much they want to depend on any single trading partner no matter how close the relationship has historically been. If you're someone who follows markets, business news, or global economics, this is a story worth bookmarking because the ripple effects will likely show up in supply chains, stock prices, and consumer costs over the coming months. Whether Carney and Trump eventually strike a new deal, or whether this standoff drags on and intensifies. The outcome will shape how North American trade functions for years to come. This is not a small regional squabble. It is a fight between two deeply connected economies. The entire world is watching how it plays out. Before we wrap up, let's quickly recap the key pieces of the story so it all sticks with you. Trump has threatened steep new tariffs, potentially as high as 50% on Canadian goods. Carney has refused to simply accept the pressure, calling the negotiations nasty while insisting Canada will keep defending its workers and businesses. Both sides disagree sharply on the numbers being used to justify these tariffs, whether it is the trade deficit figures or the fentanyl border claims. And Canada is actively working to reduce its dependence on the United States by pursuing new trade deals around the world. This kind of high-stakes economic drama is exactly what we love covering here on Wealth Frontline, because understanding these shifts early can help you make smarter decisions with your own money, whether that means how you invest, what industries you watch, or simply understanding why prices are moving the way they are. Trade wars are never just about politicians shaking hands or pointing fingers. They are about real supply chains, real jobs, and real costs that eventually land on regular people like you and me. If this video helped you understand what is really going on between the US and Canada right now, do me a favor and drop a comment below telling me what you think happens next. Do you think Carney holds his ground, or do you think economic pressure eventually forces a deal? I read through the comments and I genuinely want to know your take on this. And if you found this breakdown useful, please take a second to share it with someone who needs to understand why their bills might be about to change. This trade standoff is still unfolding in real time, which means there will be more twists coming, more statements, more threats, and probably more surprising turns before it is resolved. Make sure you are subscribed to Wealth Frontline so you do not miss the next update on the story, along with everything else we cover on money, power, and the economic decisions shaping your everyday life. Thank you for watching all the way through, and I will see you in the next one.